Hey everybody, Dr. Andy Woods here. Today is March the 17th, 2022. A very happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone out there. And today we're going to do a special show, a couple of shows actually, entitled The Days of Noah. And the reason we're talking about this is when you take a look at slide number 1 there, Matthew 24 verse 37, this is something that Jesus himself said. He said, "For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah." So there the Lord is giving us a major hint concerning what the last days will be like. If you want to understand the climate of the world, morally, spiritually, economically, technologically, etc., he says go back and take a good hard look at the days of Noah, because the way the world was just before the flood is exactly the way the world will be just before the second advent of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's why we're bringing this show to you on a prophecy update. So with those thoughts in mind, what we're going to work through are 14 characteristics of the days of Noah. I don't think we'll be able to cover all 14 of these in one show. If the Lord allows it, we'll probably only get through point 6, but we will pick it up where we left off in our next pastor's point of view together. So there are some very interesting parallels between Noah's day and our day. And I think when we're intellectually honest and make this comparison, we see how late that the hourglass is, how late in human history we're living. The first trend, and with all of these I'm going to try to draw a parallel with today by way of similarity. The first trend that we see of 14 happening in the days of Noah is there was a population explosion. And we get that from Genesis 6 verse 1, where it says concerning the days of Noah, "Now it came about when man began to multiply on the face of the land," or on the face of the earth. The Bible is very clear that the population of the human race was exponentially growing in Noah's day. Now, why was that? My thinking on it, and this of course is not original with me, you'll find this in the writings of a lot of young earth creationists, right back to the late Henry Morris, who is sort of the father of the young earth creationist movement. But there's a belief amongst many of us that at one point in time, our world, prior to the days of Noah, was surrounded by a sphere of water. And it functions sort of as a canopy around the earth, creating sort of a greenhouse effect, filtering the sun's harmful rays, allowing people to live longer. And here's another portrayal of what this canopy very well could have looked like prior to the flood. Now, where do people get this from? Well, they get it from Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. Actually focusing there on verse 7. It says, "God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so." So there was something called the expanse, and that's defined as the sky in the context. Then there was waters below the sky. That's easy to figure out. That's the oceans. But what puzzles a lot of people is it talks about waters above the expanse. So what were those waters above the expanse? Well, it very well could have been, and it's a theory, but I think it's a workable theory, that at one time in history, our world was surrounded by a sphere of water. There's a lot of reasons why this makes sense. First of all, it's implied in Genesis 1, 6, and 7, and it explains a lot. It explains why people in the genealogy of Genesis 5, Noah, Genesis 5:5 lived 930 years, and Methuselah, the oldest living man, verse 27 of Genesis 5, lived 969 years. It explains why people live so long. After the fall, but prior to the flood, this canopy would have created this sort of incubation greenhouse effect, filtering the sun's harmful rays, allowing people to live long. It also explains very strange beasts that really have no parallel to our modern day fossil record. The book of Job, mentions some strange beasts, the behemoth and the leviathan, and there's a reference to strange beasts in Genesis 1:24 and 25. So we have a lot of skeletal remains in our fossil record that don't really equate with modern day animals. And the modern term for this, although this term really didn't come about, I think, until the 1800s, is the word dinosaur, although the Bible doesn't use that word. It would also explain where the floodwaters came from. Genesis 2 verses 5 and 6 says waters came up from under the ground like a mist and used to water the whole surface of the ground. And so there was no such thing as floodwaters in this incubated world. And so when God brought the global flood, the theory is he just released the canopy. And then it explains why the genealogy in Genesis 11, after the flood, man's lifespan starts getting curtailed dramatically. You'll notice this chart here with the big line in the middle that says flood, and you'll notice the lifespans of people before the flood versus after the flood, comparing the genealogies of Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. The genealogy of Genesis 5 talks about people living into their 800s, late 700s, 900s, and then after the flood it gets cut back to now someone's living to be 600, then into their 400s, then into their 200s, and then Terah, Abraham's father, lived 205 years, and then finally Abraham lived 115 years, and it gradually got rolled back to what it is today. I think it's Psalm 90 says, if you make it to age 70 or even 80, you're considered fortunate. And why did the lifespans of people start getting curtailed? Well, the filter was gone. The canopy was gone. God used the canopy to flood the world, and there was nothing left to filter the sun's harmful rays. And so this becomes the explanation why people pre-flood were living so long. And Henry Morris has run the numbers. As you look at this chart here of the pre-flood patriarchs, people living into their 900s, having children into their 900s. Henry Morris, a credentialed scientist, has run the numbers. And you'll notice this quote here from his Genesis record. He says the world population at that time could have been at least 7 billion people. And I find that very interesting because that's basically the same number of people that we have living in our world today. Of course, that's a rough estimate. We're probably well into the 8 billions by now. But I find it very interesting that the population of the world prior to the flood was basically what it is today. And that would be parallel number one, comparing the days of Noah with our time period. There's a second, though, characteristic regarding the days of Noah, and it has to do with technological advancement. We have all been brainwashed with evolutionary thinking, where we think that we have evolved from the goo to you by way of the zoo over billions of years. And under that anthropological model, modern man is at his most sophisticated level. And as you go further back in history, man becomes, according to this model, more simple, more primitive, because he's closer to the orangutan. But the truth of the matter is, in the days of Noah before the flood, there was a great deal of technological sophistication, the frontiers of knowledge were exploding. They were being pushed back in the days of Noah. Take, for example, the ark. Building an ark of that quality, capable of floating, capable of, at its size, enduring great storms and tumultuous activity. You can imagine the mechanical engineering that goes into something like that. The spatial thinking, the aerodynamics, and all of these kinds of things. And it's obvious that Noah was no country bumpkin. He was no caveman. He obviously had a great deal of intelligence to put something like that together under God's direction. There was clearly writing in the days of Noah, because Genesis chapter 5 verse 1 says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam." Adam, in other words, wrote the book of the generations. Now, how could there be a book of the generations of Adam unless Adam had the ability to write? So he was obviously literate. Genesis 4 verse 17 says Cain, in that time period, was building a city. It says Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch, and he built a city, and he called the name of the city Enoch after the name of his son. I mean, have you built a city lately? Obviously, you're dealing with sophisticated people. Taking a look at this slide, there was a lot of other technological advancements given in Genesis 4:20 through 22. There was obviously trade going on because they had livestock. Genesis 4:20 says Ada gave birth to Jabal, and he was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. There was obviously musical instruments in that time period, because Genesis 4:21 says his brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of all of those who played the lyre and the pipe. And one of the verses in the Bible that's frequently overlooked is Genesis 4:22. It says, "As for Zillah, she gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the forger of all implements of bronze and iron." The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Now notice that they had at the same time bronze and iron. And that's totally contradicted today by the perspective of secular anthropology, which says there was a Bronze Age from about 3700 to 500 BC, and only after that time passed did you have the Iron Age, beginning about 500 BC and going all the way to about AD 800. And here your Bible says at the dawn of human history, you have these folks in the pre-flood world using bronze and iron simultaneously. Even after the flood, there was obviously a great deal of technological advancement, because they were building a tower unto heaven itself. In fact, they were so advanced in what they were doing, God had to disrupt the project to prevent them from abusing their technological abilities. It says in Genesis 11 verse 6, "The Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language, and this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them." And so it is interesting that as you go back further in time, the more intelligent and the more technologically sophisticated man becomes. You'll notice this slide shot here, The Genius of Ancient Man. It comes from an article by Don Landis entitled Ancient Man, Genius or Primitive. It's a fascinating article, and he talks about all of these innovations in history that we really have no technological explanation for today. The palace at Knossos on Crete, the La Bastida in Spain, the Great Pyramids of Egypt, which they still don't know exactly how they put all that together, the Stonehenge of England, the Great Wall of China, the architecture of the Incas, etc. So don't believe the secular anthropological model that early man, because he was very close to an orangutan, couldn't speak, and he couldn't write, and he couldn't think, and he didn't even know what fire was until lightning struck. The Bible doesn't present early man this way. Man, early in history and going back further prior to the flood, I believe had a very high level of intelligence and a very high level of sophistication. And if you lose this model that I'm presenting here, you have to have some sort of explanation for all of these wonderful technological advancements early on that Don Landis points out. And very sadly, what people are doing today is they're attributing those things to UFOs. Well, I don't have any need to attribute these things to UFOs because my Bible says early man was very, very sophisticated. And so when you compare that to today, we're in the exact same position. The people prior to the flood were technological giants, but as we'll see, they were ethical midgets. And is that not a wonderful description of today? Today we have atomic weapons, nuclear weapons. These are all innovations that have come to pass in our general lifespans. The automobile, the airplane, the ships, computers. In fact, I was watching a movie recently from the 1980s where a fellow who was very, very rich in the movie was taking a walk on the beach, and he had this cell phone, and the movie was sort of trying to portray him as, really ahead of the curve technologically. And his cell phone, as I looked at it, was absolutely obnoxious. It was too big. It had a giant antenna. And our cell phones, just within the span of a decade or two after that movie was made, are far more technologically sophisticated than what they were trying to portray in this movie a couple of decades ago. So we're literally living in a time period, just like the days of Noah, where technology is advancing rapidly. In fact, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 says, "But realize this, in the last days difficult times will come." And 2 Timothy 3, verse 7 says, "People will always be learning, yet never able to come to a knowledge of the truth." The Bible predicts that in the last days man would become a technological giant, but he would be a spiritual and ethical midget. He would be completely wrapped up in his technological advances, but he would have almost no knowledge of God and the simplicity of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I find that to be another very interesting parallel with Noah's day. Which leads us to point number 3. You would think that with all of this technology, people would have more time on their hands to really seek out the things of God, but it really had the opposite effect. The third point or parallel is that in the days of Noah, there was a tremendous insensitivity towards God. And where do we get this from? We get this from Matthew 24, verses 38 and 39, where our Lord Jesus Christ describes the days of Noah. And it's here Jesus says, "For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be." These folks in the days of Noah were so consumed with daily life, in spite of all of their technology, that they really had no time for God. And when the flood finally hit, after 120 years of warning, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this series, when the flood finally hit, it's almost as if the floodwaters took them completely by surprise. They acted as if they had no idea that this judgment was coming. And today, is it not exactly the same. We have on Sundays all kinds of activities going on now. There's sports and there's entertainment and there's family. And how many have an opportunity or take the opportunity given to them to worship the Lord consistently at their local church on Sunday morning? The malls are filled, but very, very sadly, many of our churches are empty. There's a basic insensitivity to God, not only in our culture, but in our world. Jesus predicted this. In Luke 18 and verse 8, he says, "However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?" Question mark. When Jesus comes back, is there going to be anybody that's seeking him, that's living for him, that's prioritized their lives on his account? And so this basic insensitivity towards God in the days of Noah is another striking parallel with our own time period. This takes us to our fourth point here concerning the days of Noah. The days of Noah were days of corruption. The word corruption is used in the biblical text to describe the days of Noah. Notice, if you will, Genesis 6, verses 11 and 12. It says, "Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for humanity had corrupted its way on the earth." Notice that the word in these couple of verses, corrupt, is used twice. And if that weren't enough, you see the word corrupted. Is that not a striking parallel with today, where new revelations at every level of society pour forth daily of scandals and corruption? Whether we're talking about our political institutions, our financial institutions, our religious institutions, it's one story of corruption after corruption after corruption. It's almost as if our consciences have become seared, where when the next scandal comes out, we think it's normal because scandals have become so commonplace in our society and our culture. There is another possible meaning of corruption, though, that I don't have a chance to develop in this particular show, but I'll develop it in the subsequent episode. And it has to do with the corruption of the pre-flood gene pool. And I'll have to, in that subsequent show, explain what was happening between some of the fallen angels and human women, and how fallen angels were actually procreating with human women to prevent the birth of the Messiah, and the genetics of the human race were being tampered with. More on that coming, but it certainly adds new insight to this expression, corrupt. Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence, and God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for humanity had corrupted its way on the earth. The corruption of the genetics of the human race, in addition to the corruption and scandals of the culture. Anyway, that concept of corruption is another interesting parallel that we have today with the days of Noah. This takes us to number 5 on our list. The days of Noah were days of violence. You'll notice Genesis 6, verse 11 and verse 13. It says, "The earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence." And then down in verse 13 it says, "Then God said to Noah, the end of all human society has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of people, and behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth." That word violence, it's interesting in Hebrew. When you pronounce it, it sounds an awful lot like the word Hamas. And of course, you can recognize Hamas, which is a Middle Eastern terrorist group, Semitically, the name is derived from that name, violence. So when they call themselves Hamas, they're basically saying we're not here for peace in the Middle East. We're here for violence, a terrorist group, generally anti-Israel, anti-Hebrew, anti-Semitic in tone. That's the word for violence that's used here in Genesis chapter 6, verse 11 and verse 13. And what's interesting is the pre-flood world was a violent world. It all started with the first murder a few chapters earlier. Genesis 4 verse 8 says, Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about that when they were in the field, Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. There's the first murder in human history. And as you begin to track Cain's descendants, as we like to say, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. His descendants were just as violent, if not more violent, than Cain himself. And we see that with one of his descendants named Lamech. Notice what Lamech said there in Genesis 4, verse 23. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. Give heed to my speech. For I have killed a man for wounding me, and a boy for striking me. So you'll notice that Lamech practiced not just this idea of retaliation, but if you did anything against him, he would commit acts of violence against you several times over. So if a man wounded him, he would murder that man in cold blood. If a boy, an infant, in other words, someone that is not as strong as him, struck him, then he would murder that boy. And that is what Cain began with the first murder. This is the attitude and philosophy and lifestyle that we find in Cain's descendants. And this, of course, multiplied and spiraled and compounded until by the time you get to the days of Noah, the world was just engulfed in violence. There was almost a tidal wave of violence moving across the earth. And what had been lost in all of this is the fact that man is an image bearer of God. Notice Genesis 1, 26 and 27. God said something about man when he created him. It says, Then God said, Let us make man in our image, and according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the cattle, over all the earth, over all the and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created man, verse 27, in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So you'll notice that when God created man, he says man and woman are very special, because these beings bear my image. And this is what gives us an incentive to treat people with respect. It's what gives us an incentive not to murder people in cold blood. And very, very sadly, in the days of Noah, man and woman as image bearers of God and the dignity they possessed by how God made them was lost, and murder was the result. And when somebody murders another person, that actually is a direct assault on God himself, because you have just murdered in cold blood an image bearer of God. This is why with the first murder, when Cain murdered Abel, in Genesis 4 verse 10, God asks this rhetorical question as he's now coming to Cain by way of accountability. He said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now, why would God say that? Because Abel bears my image, and you have just murdered an image bearer. This is why much later in human history, around 1500 BC, at the time of the Exodus in what's called the Mosaic covenant. God was very clear with one of the commandments where he said in Exodus 20 verse 13, "You shall not murder." So this whole concept of the protection of human life, the sanctity of human life, was lost by the time we get to the days of Noah, and that's why a tidal wave of violence was sweeping the earth. And I would just ask you, is this not happening today? One historian, David Barton, in his book called America, To Pray or Not to Pray, talks about the greatest concerns in the public schools in the 1960s, before we kicked Bible reading and prayer out of public schools. And he compares those to the greatest concerns in the 1980s. Notice what he says. In the early 1960s, the greatest disciplinary problems reported by public school teachers were talking, chewing gum, making noise, running in the halls, getting out of turn in line, wearing improper clothing, and not putting paper in wastebaskets. So that's what our society was like, with a God consciousness in it. Well, then the Supreme Court in 1963 threw Bible reading and prayer out of the schools. And what then, as a few decades passed, was the greatest concerns in public schools in the 1980s after we lost our God consciousness. Quote, by the mid-1980s, the top public school offenses were rape, robbery, assault, burglary, arson, bombings, murder, suicide, chronic absenteeism, vandalism, extortion, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, gang warfare, pregnancies, abortions, and venereal disease, close quote. So obviously things changed quite a bit from 1960 to 1980. And of course I'm laughing, not because I think it's funny. I'm laughing out of frustration, sort of as a coping mechanism, I guess. And so our world is becoming just as violent as it was in the days of Noah. I found this from a blog called HelloMotherhood.com, and it's about the amount of television kids watch today where they are exposed to violence. This blog says, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics website, children today between the ages of 2 and 18 spend an average of 3 hours each day watching television. A 3-year national television study reported by the AAP found that children's shows had the most violence of all television programming. Statistics read that some cartoons average 20 acts of violence in 1 hour. And by the age of 18, children will have seen 16,000 simulated murders and 200,000 acts of violence on television. Young people are especially in jeopardy of the negative effects of television violence because many younger children cannot discriminate between what they see and what is real, reports the American Academy of Pediatrics, close quote. I have it, I think, on a pretty good source that's told me, a friend in the military that's told me, when the military here in the United States would recruit people into the military and train them, one of the hardest things for the military to do was to teach somebody how to actually take a life. Now, obviously, you have to be trained to take a life if you're in the military because you're going to be defending our country. And, to get someone to the point where they were willing to, pull the trigger, take a life, was very, very difficult for people. And what this particular source told me is we don't have that difficulty anymore. People come into the military because they've already been desensitized to violence. Now, why is that? Well, television is taking care of that. Because as the blog piece indicates, look at all of the violence that children who have no filter at a very early age are shown regularly via television. When it comes to video games, I grew up in the time period of Atari and Pac-Man. As far as I remember, there were not a lot, if any, violent acts in the kinds of video games I played as a youth. And have you seen have you looked over the shoulders of your children and grandchildren? Have you seen the kinds of video games that they're involved in? I couldn't believe some of the things I was seeing. Blood splattering all over in cartoon form, killing as they're working their way through the video game. The fact of the matter is we're largely being desensitized to violence because of video games, because of television, because of iPhones, etc., etc. And part of the problem is we have been brainwashed with evolutionary thinking, where we think that people are really not human beings that bear God's image, but they're just sort of a naked ape. They're an evolved ape. And if they're an evolved animal, then why not treat them like an animal? There's no problem slandering them. There's no problem tearing them down. There's no problem doing them physical harm or physical injury. And because we are a society and a culture and a world that's moved away from the divine standard of the sanctity of human life, our culture and our society has become very, very violent. Of course, the most innocent victims of all of this violence are children in the wombs of their mothers. It's now open season on them. It's been this way ever since the infamous Roe versus Wade decision of 1973, which basically legalized constitutionally abortion on demand up to, in many cases, the 9th month of pregnancy. And it's almost infanticide. It is infanticide in many cases, what we're practicing today. And there have been 1.5 million with an M deaths per year since the Roe versus Wade decision. And if there is a war of violence on the unborn, it's not long until there's a war of violence on the born, because all of it relates to losing the standard of the fact that our fellow human beings are image bearers of God, and therefore life should be treated with an attitude of the sanctity of life. All of that's being lost today as our culture, via wars on the born and the unborn, is becoming more and more violent. And I'm here to tell you that that's exactly what was happening in the days of Noah. I mean, this may be what Jesus was talking about when he says, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be. Man and woman as image bearers, that status had been lost. The sanctity of life had been lost, and society became very, very violent. And that's a direct parallel with our world today. Let me take you to a sixth area, another parallel between the days of Noah and today. And it has to do with the ridicule of God's people. When Noah was proclaiming his message, which he did for 120 years, Genesis 6 verse 3 says that, and he was building this giant ark, there is no doubt in my mind that this man and his family were the subject of tremendous ridicule. And the reason I think that is because the society in Noah's day, prior to the flood, had no conceptual idea of rain, the best I can tell. Why do I think that? Because of Genesis 2 verses 5 and 6, which says, "Now no shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord God had not yet sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground. But a mist used to rise from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground, close quote. So the way it worked, the best I can tell in the pre-flood world, is water came up from under the ground like a mist, and that's what watered the ground. And because of the canopy that I tried to describe earlier, this giant ball of water that surrounded our earth and kept the earth in sort of a greenhouse incubation type of environment, it's very likely that the pre-flood world had absolutely no knowledge of rain. They had no conceptual understanding of rain. Now think about how absurd Noah and his message seemed. He preached his message for 120 years. He clearly was a preacher of righteousness, 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 5 says. And yet he was building an ark of giant proportions and preaching a coming deluge to a generation of people that didn't even know what rain was. I mean, he probably seemed like the most extreme, radical, insane person on planet Earth. And think of the laughter and the derision that this man was subjected to. And the only reason he was able to do what he did is he trusted God completely at his word, and he had to put out of his mind the way things normally were working in the pre-flood world. So when we look at Genesis chapter 6 verse 5, we see the wickedness of the people. It says, the Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great on the earth, and every intent of the thoughts of their heart was only evil continually. We know Genesis 6 verse 3 that there was this window of 120 years where Noah was preaching. Genesis 6 verse 3 says, nevertheless, his days will be 120 years. So I've given you earlier the Henry Morris quote that there were at least 7 billion people on planet Earth. We know from 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 5 that Noah was a preacher. That is a proclaimer of righteousness. And so ask yourself this question: how much success did Noah have in his ministry? Well, of 7 to 8 billion people, 1 Peter 3:20 indicates that there were only 8 persons who were brought safely through the water. 2 Peter 2 and verse 5 says the only people on the ark were Noah with 7 others. So 8 total on the ark. Now, who would those 8 be? Well, presumably Noah and his wife. And we know that Noah had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and their respective wives. So those were the 8. Noah and his wife, his 3 sons, and their respective wives. And those are the only people that made it through the old world into the new world. And that's after 120 years of preaching to 7 billion people. You want to talk about frustration in the ministry? You want to talk about a lack of success in the ministry? A lack of effectiveness in the ministry? That's who Noah was. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind the ridicule that he went through as he was warning of this deluge, building this giant contraption called the ark to a group of people that were wicked and hardened against God and had absolutely no knowledge of even the concept of rain. When you start to factor in all of these things and all of the ridicule that Noah endured, you begin to understand why Noah is always held out as an example for us to follow. Ezekiel 14:14 says, even though these 3 men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst, by their own righteousness they could only deliver themselves, declares the Lord. You see the same 3 names mentioned in Ezekiel 14 verse 20. Noah is right there with Daniel, a very righteous man, and Job a very righteous man. This is why Noah is featured in the Hall of Faith, Hebrews 11. The greats of the faith who believed God in spite of all odds. Noah is mentioned in their midst. Hebrews 11 verse 7 says, by faith, Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness, which is according to faith. And the perpetual ridicule that he went through was clearly something that was happening in the days of Noah. And compare that to today. Look at how the people of God are maligned. Look at how the people of God are ridiculed. You know, ridicule is a very powerful tool. It's one thing to get up and refute what someone says, to try to stop them. It's one thing to debunk somebody. It's a totally different matter when you just make fun of them, because no one likes to be made fun of. Everybody wants to fit in. And Satan uses the tool of ridicule to get us away from speaking the things of God. This is what happened to the prophets just before the Babylonian captivity. It says in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 16, but they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. And this type of ridicule is something that is predicted for the last days. 2 Peter 3 and 4 says, knowing first of all that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. Notice verse 3, you have mockers and mocking, and they will ridicule the doctrine of the second coming, and those that promote the doctrine of the second coming, just as Noah was ridiculed in his pre-flood ministry. You find a similar prediction in the book of Jude, verse 18, which says, they were saying to you, in the last days there will be mockers, following after their own ungodly lusts. And just as Noah's message seemed foolish, the things of God today seem foolish to the natural man that doesn't have the Holy Spirit within him. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 14 says, but a natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them because they are spiritually appraised. You know, when you speak the things of God, people look at you as if you're foolish, as if you are moronic, because what you're talking about doesn't make any sense to them. Just like the announcement of the flood and the building of the ark made no sense to the pre-flood world that had no conceptual knowledge or understanding of rain. And so the ridicule of God's people is a sign that existed in the days of Noah, and it has a direct parallel to today. If nothing else, do this exercise the next time you're watching a movie. Whenever the Christian, so-called Christian, is portrayed in the movie, just watch the storyline develop. It's just a matter of time before you learn in the rest of that movie that that so-called Christian is either a serial murderer, or a terrorist. I'm thinking of the movie The Shawshank Redemption. It's interesting that the Christian, the Bible toter, the biblicist in the movie, turned out to be the warden, who was the villain of the entire movie. And you'll see this over and over again in these themes produced in Hollywood, that always ridicule, always malign, always put down the Christian. So let's bring this first episode of 2 parts, the days of Noah, to a close here. Just by way of review, we went over 6 characteristics of the days of Noah. Those were a population explosion, just like today, technological advancement, just like today, an insensitivity towards the things of God, just like today. Those were days of corruption, just like they are today. The world was filled with violence, just like it is today. And there was a ridicule of God's people, just like there is today. Now, the next 4 points that I'll be giving you are going to be connected to the angelic interpretation of Genesis 6. And so that's too much to get into today, but in our next show together, we'll walk through the angel view of Genesis 6. And once we walk through the angel view of Genesis 6, I will show you 4 additional points about the days of Noah flowing from that interpretation. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. God bless you.